Hello, everybody. Welcome to our July AMA. My name is Alicia Foreman and I work with the Pactflow team. I'm very excited to have a very special guest and a really deep dive topic for us to discuss today. I'm going to do a couple of introductions and then we're going to dive in because we've got a lot of content to discuss throughout this session and hoping to get through it all. Just a quick note, this is of course an Ask Me Anything, so we've got some pre-prepared questions, but we're also taking questions, live questions from the audience. Please do pop your questions into the comment section and we will get to those as we go through. So let's do some intros. I'm going to start with our special guest. We are really excited to have Tim Jones joining us today. I'll just give a bit of an introduction. So Tim is an independent consultant specializing in cloud delivery and legacy environments, writing software you can reason about, and drinking tea. I hope you have a cup of tea with you there this morning, Tim.
Actually, trying to make one.
Wonderful. Tim has worked with OpenAPI specs in enterprise environments enough times to get burned and to make mistakes and is keen to share those mistakes so that you can avoid them too. He's also one of the core Pact open source core maintainers, and he is a friend of Pactflow. Additionally, we've got some of our usual suspects joining us this morning as well. We've got Beth Scurry and Matt Fellows as well, who are our leads and co-founders of Pactflow and also core maintainers on the Pact open source project as well. So I'll just hand over anyone who wants to jump in and say a quick hello, and then we can have a bit of a discussion about schema testing.
I can start us off. Why don't you go, Beth?
Oh, okay. Hello. Do I need to introduce myself? I think Alicia did a great introduction.
Thank you.
I think so too.
That's all.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Tim, it's a real pleasure to have you along today, and we're really excited to talk to you about this topic. We know it.
Ooh, you've gone on mute.
Can't hear you.
Oh. Fail of the century. There we go. There's some light entertainment for your mornings or your evenings, no matter where you are. I don't know what you guys caught of that, but what I was saying was excited to have Tim here. And also just a little note, I think the topic of schema testing is one that we talk about a lot. And we've recently published a blog post over on the Pactflow blog, just in regards to that. And it's kind of shaped a little bit of this session this morning. So let's jump into it. Team, I'm just going to probably throw out some questions. And then we can sort of bounce around and have a bit of a discussion. We've got a couple of us along this morning, so really keen for just this to be quite organic and talk through. So let's start with the baseline and the simple one. So what are schemas, specifications, and contracts?
So the example that I like most for schemas versus contracts is that usually a schema describes the kinds of messages that you can create, and they tend to be a little bit generative, sort of like a grammar, so that you can say, from this definition, I can generate some messages that I know will adhere to this schema. And there's the example of the grammatically correct sentence that doesn't carry any meaning, which is the colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is like a sentence that is grammatically correct but not
sensical.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas to me, the contract in contract testing is sort of a definition of some messages, but also a set of examples. And typically when people are doing OpenAPI testing or when they're doing OpenAPI specs to drive their testing, they tend to pair it with like a collection of examples, like a Postman collection that they can use to go through the API and confirm that that it's still behaving as expected. Did you want to add to that, Matt?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great example. I love the colorless green sentence. I think it just anchors the point. So maybe going to the article, when I was sort of thinking about this, I was trying to go, well, what is the difference between a schema and a specification and a contract? So for me, I haven't got a good difference between a schema and a specification. I've tried to get to the bottom of it, and to be honest, I don't have a good inkling if there's a big enough difference to be talking about it. But like looking at JSON schema, which is the schema behind OpenAPI specification, for example. So there's probably something slightly different in the sense that OpenAPI, for example, uses JSON schema to do its job. So there's probably something higher level about a specification that it captures, but it highly relies on a schema itself. So I think in the sense that JSON schema is a very, very general data format, I guess data validation format. A specification, OpenAPI spec, basically just overlays some HTTP semantics on it, but it still doesn't add the level of semantics you're talking about to actually make it sensible. But even going to the JSON schema website, if you actually look at it, tries to take you right from the start. What is a schema? And it goes on to talk about it, but then it says you may have noticed that the JSON schema itself is written in JSON. It is data, not a program, and it's a declarative format for describing the structure of other data, and kind of describes it as both its strength and its weakness. Right? It says, and this is what it shares with other schema languages. So it's really easy and concise to describe the surface area of the data and automating validation against it. However, since it can't contain arbitrary code, there are certain constraints on relationships between data elements that can't be expressed. And then it says any validation tool, in quotes, for a sufficiently complex data format, therefore will likely have to have two phases of validation, one at the schema or structural level and one at the semantic level. And so the latter check will need to be implemented by something more general purpose. And I think that's where we get to contracts. So schemas are abstract. Schemas, as you said, Tim, aim to provide a generalized format for describing information. Where contracts comes into their own is basically saying, okay, we're probably still going to have some level of schema or data validation there. We may even use tools like JSON schema, but a contract is a few things. It's the exact specified example, so specification by example, sorry. So at least with Pact, what we want is this is exactly what the consumer needs to do of this particular API. When we do that, we've now got the examples laid out in front of us. We may also use those schemas to improve the validation logic around it to keep those in sync. So at the very least, you have that. The next thing with contract testing is it overlays the ability to evolve over time. And again, schemas don't capture that at all. Contract testing is designed to allow the evolution. So I think those are three dimensions at a minimum would qualify something as a contract. And that's why I tend to say that schemas are not contracts, because they're very static, very general definitions of how we describe data. Yeah.
I think that sort of there's maybe a sort of like a legal analogy in that in a contract test, you want to say these two services are able to communicate with each other, and that in a schema test, you're saying, the messages coming out of this service or coming into the service adhere to a particular sort of template, and that they're not exactly the same. Like when I think when I started, I thought, well, yeah, I mean, maybe these are technically different, but they don't really, but that doesn't really matter. But then, having situations where you've got two services where you've generated both the API client and the server from the OpenAPI spec, but they can't talk to each other because they're filling in the data like differently, and how you are using the fields makes a difference. Which data you're putting on the wire. One of my favorite examples of the deficiencies is that if you've got sort of multiple payload types, and maybe you're switching on a string to determine which type of payload it is, or like maybe you're like, oh, if it has this field, then it must be that type. But if you've got that, what tends to happen is that all of the fields of those two types are merged together, and they're all optional. And maybe there might be a more powerful spec that you could use to describe that would obviate the problem of needing to pair it with examples.
Yeah, well, actually, the one that comes to my mind here is I'm not sure if you've come across a tool called Schematron.
No,
You haven't. It is an Oasis specification, and in a past life, I used this to great effect, to be honest, to build form validation. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from a cold. Basically, this was back in the day when XML was still popular, and what you would do is you would use SOAP or what have you, and you would add a Schematron layer over the top of it, which would give you those rules. And basically those rules were written as predicates. But so on the, yes, it was still kind of an XML static thing, but it kind of had predicates built into it. And those predicates themselves were essentially some form of generalized programming language. And someone had to write those rules, and they were not general. So JSON schema was obviously general. These were very specific rules. So I think there's something in that you still need to combine some other thing. So you didn't get that for free with SOAP. You still needed something like Schematron, which said if this then that, basically, which I think is kind of fascinating. So let's maybe carry this conversation forward a bit. I think Beam's got a question here, and this maybe get to it. I guess let's talk about why you might want a schema in the first place. So like, what are the benefits of having a schema, and what is the benefits of having a contract, and do these things overlap, and is that okay? What do you think?
I sort of think that the schema in OpenAPI spec is sort of for a different, I think it originally isn't for, are these two services able to talk to each other? It's for things like, what are the sorts of messages that I think will be valid and appropriate, and you can automatically generate your validation, which is really nice. You can use them on API gateways to say, yes, these payloads that I'm getting are the correct payloads, and potentially use it for routing. It's very nice to describe the surface that you do have this way. I'm sure most people have seen the Swagger UI, which is quite a nice way of sort of browsing an API to see what you have. It's a sort of nice documentation tool. Whereas, even if we did, we could present Pact files in a similar way, which would be nice, but it wouldn't be as it's not as sort of complete at describing, because Pact is not for functional testing. An example of each type of payload would be very nice, and that's typically the thing that's missing in documentation that's created from OpenAPI. So I mean, it's definitely not valueless, but I think I think they're four different things. I haven't. If you are only going to have one, of course, my preference is to only have Pact, because that's the thing that I can use to know that I'm able to deploy these two things together, and I can't use the spec to do that. But it is very nice to, the features of things like automatically generating your client and consumer code. You made a really good point the other day, Matt, about sort of like coming full circle to the SOAP world of automatically generating the stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, just carrying on that conversation, and we sort of focus a bit on OpenAPI spec now, but more broadly speaking, OpenAPI spec is probably just the most popular one. Totally. Simply because RESTful APIs and microservices. So, but if you think about protobufs and GRPC, protobuf is a specification of sorts. And very, very common. These are the kinds of questions I hear very common from clients and customers. It's like, well, I'm using protobufs, therefore I already have backwards compatibility built in. I don't need to do pack testing because I have it. I'm using GraphQL because it has backwards compatibility and schema built in. I don't need contract testing. I already have an OpenAPI specification. Why am I doing pack testing as well? And all those tools actually share this common problem. Sorry, Tim, you go on.
Yeah, I hear that a lot too. And I mean, sort of you have the situation where that's fine. That both of these sides adhere to this schema, but you have different versions. GraphQL, I think, has this feature where you can say, hey, can you tell me what your schema is, please? And then you get a you can get a yes/no answer of like, am I able to talk to the service like right now? But that's sort of not the right time to learn that, because at that point you were deployed. So even if you're taking that argument, you need some way of knowing, hey, is it safe to deploy these two things together? And I know that Beth has made the point before that like the Pact broker is actually just a generic contract broker, and that you could put other things in it. Which version of the schema is supported by which version of the consumer and provider. But there's also the challenge that there are it's trivial to create an example of two services that implement the same spec from an OpenAPI perspective and cannot talk to each other. I don't know so much about GRPC and so on, but I don't know if there are the same kind of examples.
I'll talk about those in a sec. I think, Beth, you're going to say something?
Yeah, coming back to what the question you asked about the trade-offs. I think some of the important trade-offs that we've realized as we've been looking at OpenAPI and Pact over the last few years is the time trade-off. Specifications are obviously, because they're static, so much quicker to get feedback from compared to something that requires you to execute actual examples. And of course, verifying a pact is still quicker than actually running integration tests on a deployed environment. But for some people, I've heard of like a pact verification step taking like 20 minutes just because they have that level of coverage, and the setup and tear down just does take a while. So for some people, the trade-off between getting quick feedback that is not as accurate versus slow, very accurate feedback, they feel that the quick is more useful to them. And that's actually why the Atlassian model, what we call the Atlassian model, which Atlassian came up with, was first invented internal to Atlassian. For them, they generate a pact on the consumer side, and they verify that pact against an OpenAPI specification because they found that the quickness of that feedback was more valuable for them than the waiting longer for more accurate feedback. So what I'd like to be able to see is these two things working together to be able to get quick feedback with a pact and an OpenAPI spec, and then have that more fine-grained, accurate, highly valuable verification of the pact, the classic pact verification, add to that certainty. I think that'd be a very useful model.
It's kind of interesting. Like I've seen situations where the verification against the spec fails because of constraints like field length and so on. It says, this request this string is too long. And then, but the actual verification with a pact test would succeed, and it's because the service wasn't behaving exactly as it was defined in the spec. And that's interesting. That was a false failure, but I think that if you're careful about it, it wouldn't matter so much. That's
obviously why the OAS on its own is almost worthless unless you have something that verifies that the provider actually implements that OAS. And that's part of the model that we've been working on, is that when you have contracts on either side, you want to have something that makes sure that those contracts are actually valid contracts before you can even compare the two contracts. If you compare an OAS and a pact, there's no point verifying that they're compatible unless we have a certain level of guarantee that the OAS is actually valid.
Yeah, you have to be really careful though. I mean, I know that we've spoken about this before, and people who have used the Atlassian validator will have also hit this. But you have to be really careful what's in your OpenAPI spec at the time of validation, because it's not for contract validation, by default it's really permissive. So it will let you put in arbitrary extra fields, which means that in the pact you can say, hey, I require this in the response. And then it will say, well, this matches the OpenAPI spec because it doesn't forbid those fields, because you're allowed to just add arbitrary extra fields. And so like technically you can create that, but sort of what I want is a mode that says this is valid according to this spec and also described in the spec. But because of some reasons, it's not a straightforward feature to add. So you have to be careful to say, because by default it's permissive, but you can turn all of that stuff off.
It's worth mentioning really quick, Tim. I think we're talking about things like the predicates like any of and one of. If you use those in polymorphic payloads and you have additional properties, so without going too much into the meat of the detail here, because it's a long topic, we can link to it afterwards in the comments. But basically, OpenAPI uses JSON schema under the hood and defers down to JSON schema to do the actual field level validations.
That's right.
The issue is if you use one of the OpenAPI predicates called any of or one of, these kinds of things, where you can say, given this input, it can be one of these outputs or any of these outputs. What happens is, you've got one problem now. You don't know which individual input is going to go to which output. And that is a general problem of what we talked about before with what Pact solves, because it gives it a very clear one-to-one mapping of this request gets me this shape response. This request gives me that shape response. That's the first problem. The second problem is the way it has to check the data matches. It has to match across two different schemas, and it defaults to going, well, it can be any now. And if you use that predicate and you basically any response body you're expecting on the consumer side now defaults to basically there's a property in JSON schema called allow additional properties. That basically says, whatever. That's not so bad on the input, because on a request, the API can just ignore those properties. But if you're expecting extra properties or expecting properties on the response, and additional properties are set to true, that basically means it will pass validation even if the provider doesn't actually send that back. Now, what I will say is I think that's a deficiency of the Atlassian tool, and I've shown that by using other tools combined to do a similar workflow, we can actually work around that exact problem. The additional properties in general is not something we can solve, because obviously as soon as you turn additional properties to true, the JSON schema validation will allow extra properties. But if you have it to false on the schema you care about and you're using the predicates, we can actually work around that problem. I think that's actually a problem that's unique to the way Atlassian wires together JSON schema against the OpenAPI spec.
Yeah.
So I'll chat with you offline about that, Tim.
Yeah, I'd love that. We also sometimes get the question, can I generate my Pact from the spec, or the other way around, can I generate a spec from my Pact? And the first way around, which is also a question I had when I first started using it. So the first question, can I generate the Pact from the spec? The answer is no, because we need to know examples. This particular payload leads to this particular response, and as far as I'm aware, there isn't a way to specify that cleanly in general in OpenAPI. And the other way around, can I take this Pact file and generate a spec for it? I think it would be possible, but I'm not sure how useful it would be, because so Pact, like things that Pact doesn't do, like it doesn't aim to describe your entire API surface. It just aims to describe, these particular request and response pairs from this particular consumer and provider pair. Which is much more directly useful for testing and sort of sidesteps a lot of the questions about, well, how do I generalize this? Because we specifically don't, it's specifically not a general tool, because you don't want to know in general what's the sort of surface the API is at the time you're deploying. What you want to know when you're deploying is this going to be safe?
Does it specifically work?
Yes,
does it generally work?
Yeah, and it's sort of funny that, we're getting deep into theory about, well, what are the subtleties and the differences, so that people don't have to know anything about the theory at the time they're using the tool.
But I think you sort of stumbled upon the key point here. And I think if you could crudely delineate the differences, one describes an API and one tests an API, right? Like, so Pact is specifically designed around testing. and its unique specialty is around testing. It just happens to overlap with some of the concerns with schemas, because it's going to use it has its own format of a schema, but the schema is purposely built for API checking, right?
Yeah.
Whereas a schema is a more generalized way of describing an API, and that gives you certain capabilities, but they, and the Venn diagrams overlap. But in terms of the power, I guess the reasoning power around correctness, it's just higher with a Pact file, with a Pact contract.
The purpose of the contract is not to be a contract, or rather the purpose of the Pact is not to be there for itself. It is to make sure that these two sets of code and two different code bases work correctly together. And the Pact is a means to that end, rather than a thing in itself, where we're really trying to write a unit test for this integration point, and we're distributing that unit test into two different code bases.
Yeah.
And the thing that keeps those two sets of tests in sync is the contract. So it's a nice byproduct to have this document, but it's not there for its own purpose.
Yeah. So Phil has just put a question out there. Do you think that there's benefit in having both the Pact and an OpenAPI? So I'm just going to pull it up on the screen. Sorry, Beam, I know your question's there, but this is a little bit more focused on OpenAPI at the moment, so we'll try and come back to that. But do you think there's benefit in having both a Pact and an OpenAPI? And if so, wouldn't that be the answer to the question, what purpose would it solve? Maybe I'll put it to you folks.
Yeah, I definitely think there's benefit in both of them. So a lot of this does come down to what are the tools for, and that OpenAPI is so general that it sort of depends on what the teams are using it for. The benefits in the OpenAPI world are things like, I can automatically generate the validation so that I know that I'm not going to spend, as a developer, I'm not going to spend time building out the controllers, because I can just automatically have them. But you still have to do some sort of business validation. It's not like, oh, the controller is complete now, I can just immediately hand this object down to the layer below, because maybe there's business rules that you want to validate as soon as it enters into the layer below, or at some point. So it's not completely a silver bullet, and we still have to write software, which is good because it means we still have jobs. And whereas Pact really answers the question of, is it safe to deploy these two services together, or before that, can these two services talk to each other? I think that OpenAPI is well known. Like, if you said, hey, I'm describing this surface, here's my Swagger document, the answer to that is usually, oh yeah, not what? It really does have the benefit that even though it's not a perfect tool for describing payloads and it has some deficiencies, it's very well known.
It's easy to understand. As a developer, imagine you have two services that are talking to each other, and another service now wants to use the same provider. The Pact might not be very useful, because all the Pact is doing is describing the interactions between the existing services, but it doesn't describe the full surface area of the API. So Pact is a contract testing tool that can be used for documenting, and OpenAPI is a documentation tool that can be used a bit for contract testing. So they've each got different purposes that kind of merge a little bit towards each other. But yeah, if you need to a bunch of different services to use a provider, just seeing how other people have used that provider isn't sufficient in itself. We need to know what the full capability of that provider is.
So because the contract in a Pact contract is a set of examples, and that typically if people are doing contract testing manually and using OpenAPI and not Pact, they tend to have a paired Postman collection. So I have been wanting to create something that will create Postman collections from Pact files. And when Matt and I were talking in the lead up to this, he made the excellent point that in that Postman collection that you have, it's often been created by manual in order to be run manually. It's often been created manually, and that has some clear downsides. Like, how do you know that this is what the consumer can actually generate, or how do you know these are the responses the provider will actually generate? But that tends to have quite a bit of functional coverage. That tends to be where the functional tests, black box tests of your API live, and that specifically Pact is not for functional testing. And I think it's good to have some functional coverage, but that's sort of a separate.
It's a byproduct.
Topic. Yeah, that's right. And so even if we could, because if things are for the same purpose, we should be able to convert from one to the other. And so, can you take a Pact file and make it into a Postman collection? Can you take a Postman collection and make it into a Swagger document? Can you take because as soon as you can convert, then you get all the benefit of the other tooling. Can I take my Pact file and generate my consumer and provider code? And I think probably not, but I'm not sure. Because in a Pact file, whether you're using the matches to make it a generic template or not doesn't really matter. The best advice is to use the matches a lot, but because you've got the server state, you can be like, well, the user looks like this in the example payload. But then you might produce, if you were to use that to automatically generate your provider code, then you have a controller that can only produce one user. So you've got to be careful.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I pose to the people who are doing my advanced provider workshops is, could you implement a provider that passes the Pact tests but is completely bollocks? I've seen that. It does nothing. And the answer is yes, you can. I mean, the mock service is essentially that. It's a implementation of a provider that passes the Pact test, but does not do anything. So each of these types of tests has a specific purpose, but on their own, they're not sufficient.
Yeah, I feel like that argument is a bit weak though, because I've got this complex unit testing suite. Could I implement some code that passes the unit test and doesn't work? Of course you could.
Yes. You wouldn't, but it's a thought exercise to show you that the different types of testing we need are valuable, and we need all those different types of tests to work together and to have their individual concerns, and each of those individual concerns is valuable.
Yeah. I mean, pragmatically, on Phil's question, I personally get different value out of the tools. I find it difficult just using OpenAPI to get the value of, can these two services talk to each other? And so that's why I would use Pact for that. You can still do that, but you would have to pair it with things that cover the gaps that OpenAPI doesn't provide. Things like, how do I need to broker these contracts and know if it's possible for, are these two versions compatible, that kind of thing.
Maybe if I can just quickly generalize that problem, so it doesn't make sense to do that together. So I think if you remove OpenAPI and think about other technologies, let's say protobufs, for example. Protobufs, there's no doing protobufs without some other things. So for example, you can do RESTful APIs without OpenAPI, right? You don't need OpenAPI to do an API.
That's right.
But if you're doing protobufs over gRPC, you need to use protobufs. There's no choice. Do I use protobufs or not?
Right.
I mean, you can certainly use gRPC without protobufs, but if you're using protobufs, it is both the specification and the schema and all that wrapped into one. Yeah. So the question is, would you use? So asking the same question, but without technologies, does it make sense to have Pact and protobufs? And you can insert blank for any of those specifications. And what you see is that there's this generalized problem. You can say the same thing with Avro, same thing with GraphQL. There's unique differences for all these things, obviously. So the general problem is the schema, and this is a framing that Beth and I, we sort of work to, is you can't say that you're compatible with the schema. You say, I'm not incompatible with it. It's the only thing you can do. because a schema is general. There's really no, unless you build some mathematical proof into your testing, which is very difficult to do, and I don't believe you can do it with the tools we've got. You basically have to say, here's all the tests I've got, but you're basically trying to disprove it. So you've never actually proven it. You just haven't disproven it, right? This is the scientific theory of APIs. So what Pact gives you is it takes away the vagueness of that theory and says, well, it doesn't matter if I implement the spec or not. Let's hope I do. But for argument's sake, we don't. Pact makes it very clear. These are the exact examples that we have, and that's all that matters. And so you kind of get the benefits of both. And with protobufs specifically, protobufs is kind of like JSON. It just says string value, number value, so on. It doesn't say this thing's a date, this thing's a UID. It doesn't have any of that kind of information. And so you still need some extra level of protection to give you that. Furthermore, yes, it's backwards compatible in the sense that a newer version of a protobuf, you can still send an old message to it. But what is the actual behavior at runtime? Like if your provider will still accept an old message that's missing some critical new field, great. The protobuf doesn't blow up on the wire. Excuse me. But it's actually going to work. Like it doesn't make sense to me to support that. So it's a protocol level, a wire level validation we're talking about here. And so we're talking about a higher level of testing that you need to overlay on top of these things. So coming back to the question, well, yeah, the answer is probably you could use both. And into the generalized problem here, using the best of breed, if you will, for the different types of things, bring them together is a good thing. And if you go back to your general testing strategy, almost always when you've got your pyramid of tests, there's no clean, bright lines between each of the layers. That they blend and they blur, and that's usually okay because that gives you the confidence that the seams, it's like the welding seams in between it. There's always this kind of bumpy bit, and that's just the way it is, and that's okay. And that's a trade-off that we take, right? We say, well, there's a bit of overlap, but that gives us a bit of flexibility, a bit of confidence. If there was no overlap, then you're losing some confidence. So that's a trade-off that you guys need to make. And basically, as engineers, your whole job is just working out trade-offs and what the overlap is you're willing to to accept and what the consequences are. So now we're going to have time a little bit. I might say, I'll let maybe some final words from you, Tim, and maybe we'll go around the table. But sorry, feel free to finish that thought off.
I think in general, it's the same actually. In general, there's this sort of interesting thing that like no tests are necessary. All tests are risk reduction, and the risk that you're reducing with contract testing and Pact specifically is that you have services that can't talk to each other, and the risk that you're reducing is deploying those together. There are lots of I've had one of the selling points is, oh well, now you don't have to do complex integration tests. And I've had people say, oh well, we do complex integration tests and we already have all that infrastructure, so we don't need Pact. And the answer to that might be like, yeah, you don't. You don't have to use it, but it reduces the risk in this way that I think is convenient. And I don't see an easy way to reduce the risk in that way with spec only tests. And so, and I think that it's worth keeping in mind those things, because the other thing that we sometimes get is people saying, oh, well, I don't need Pact because we have schemas already. Again, you don't need to use Pact, but often if you unpack that argument, then it doesn't continue to hold, because it would be a bit like saying I don't need Pact because I've got both teams, like we only have one team, so we just talk to each other. And it's like, that argument removes the need for any testing. So it's what benefit is this bringing to you, and being honest about that benefit. Because if you're using the spec in a particular way and you're enforcing that the same version of the spec is on both, and you have a set of examples so that developers can know, oh, this payload is for that, then maybe you wouldn't need Pact. But I think that it's certainly the easiest way to provide all of those things.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Beth, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
One last thought I had was that the number of people in the Pact Foundation channels for OAS and GraphQL and protobuf to me suggests that there is obviously a need for more than just an OAS, a GraphQL, and a protobuf, because there wouldn't be so many people asking for the Pact tool to work with these if there wasn't some problem that people had found.
Yeah, absolutely. I think GRPC and protobufs is the #1 feature on our open source request board, as well as, you know, Pactflow. We get customers asking us all the time, so where's that GRPC thing at? We'd really like to do it. Can we convince you that it's a problem? And I literally had a customer a month or two ago, you know, get on a call with them from Germany, and they're like, these are the extra reasons you haven't articulated as to why we need this. I'm like, oh, thank you very much. That's good. I need to write a blog about that. So yeah, keep your eyes out. A blog's coming soonish, maybe. On that. But I think we've kind of discussed, I think, the general problem here anyway. And
the possibility of having plugins that will support this kind of stuff, so that we can get that get support for those things like for free across all of the Pact framework, different languages, will be pretty exciting.
Yeah, super exciting. All right. Well, I think we covered all the things we were trying to get through today. We kind of talked about the definitions of the things, the different purposes. We've talked about cross purposes a lot. Potentially, you know, using them together, how we can, you know, I guess, use these different tools effectively, and really talked about trade-offs of those. I think Beth's point around the workflow and the speed of feedback was an interesting side there, and that sort of the case study about how Atlassian used that, and we can probably link to that in the description afterwards. And, you know, just a general problem of validating generalized schemas, you know, the not incompatible things. So I think we got through the things we're hoping to get through. Tim, really appreciate you coming along to share your thoughts. Looking forward to the Postman Pact Swagger plugin.
It's on the list underneath all the other things that I'm keen to do.
Thanks. And I'll hand back to Alicia to wrap things up.
Awesome. Good conversation, guys. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim. We really appreciate your time today. Very enthusiastic about this topic and very knowledgeable. And Beth and Matt, always a pleasure to have you with us. We did go a little bit longer, and I think that was great. Happy to answer any more questions, I guess, over on the Pact Slack channel. As I said, I'll pop a note in the comments of YouTube as well for people to join. That is the Pactflow-AMA channel. Let's wrap it up, and we look forward to having you join us next month. We'll have another special guest, which we'll announce very soon. Have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.